The stale air of the gym hung heavy, thick with the scent of sweat and metal. Weights clanked, grunts echoed, and the rhythmic thud of feet on treadmills created a constant, low hum. In the middle of this organized chaos, Bruce Lee moved with a fluid grace that seemed out of place. He wasn't lifting massive barbells or flexing in front of mirrors. Instead, he was a blur of controlled motion. His body a whip-like instrument, practicing forms with an intensity that drew a few curious glances. He was lean, all sinew and sharp angles, a stark contrast to the hulking figures that dominated the space. Suddenly, a shadow fell over him. He paused, his movements stopping mid-flow, and slowly turned. Towering above him was a man-mountain, a bodybuilder whose chest seemed to span the width of a small car. His arms were like tree trunks, his neck a thick pillar of muscle. The bodybuilder's face, a mask of self-satisfaction, crinkled into a sneer. He looked down at Lee, his eyes raking over Lee's slender frame with open contempt. "You're nothing but bones," the giant rumbled, his voice a low growl that carried easily over the gym's background noise. The words were heavy with dismissal, dripping with a condescending arrogance. He made it clear he saw Lee as insignificant, a mere wisp compared to his own bulk. There was a challenge in his tone, a deep-seated disrespect for everything Lee represented, the speed, the precision, the focus on internal power over sheer mass. He believed his 300 pounds of muscle made him superior, an unmovable force. Lee's immediate reaction wasn't what anyone expected. There was no flinch, no sign of fear, not even a flicker of anger. Instead, his dark eyes met the bodybuilder's gaze, holding it with a calm intensity that felt almost unnerving. A subtle shift occurred in his posture, a barely perceptible tightening of his core, a slight angling of his body. It was a movement so small, yet it spoke volumes, hinting at a readiness, a coiled energy about to be unleashed. The air around them seemed to thicken, charged with an unspoken tension, a silent countdown. A few nearby gym-goers, sensing the shift, paused their workouts, their eyes now fixed on the brewing confrontation. The bodybuilder, oblivious to the subtle warning, let out a short, dismissive laugh, a sound full of his own unshakable confidence. He took a step closer, perhaps intending to further belittle Lee, to drive home his point about physical dominance. But he never got the chance. What happened next was swift, almost too fast to follow. It was a movement so fluid, so economical, that it seemed to defy the laws of physics. One moment the bodybuilder was sneering, full of himself. The next, his eyes widened, his smug expression replaced by a look of utter shock, then a flash of bewildered pain. His massive frame, which had seemed so solid, suddenly buckled slightly. He gasped a short, sharp intake of breath and stumbled back a step. The loud clanking of weights and the thumping of feet in the gym seemed to fade into a distant hum for a split second. The full extent of Lee's counter was not revealed, only its immediate, undeniable impact. The sheer surprise on the bodybuilder's face was enough. In 5 seconds, Bones became an undeniable force. The bodybuilder clutched his right arm, his face contorted, a mixture of disbelief and dawning, painful realization spreading across it. He looked at Lee, then back at his arm, as if trying to understand how something so small could cause such a sudden, sharp ache. The smugness was gone, replaced by a raw, unvarnished astonishment. The gym, which had briefly hushed, now seemed to hold its breath, waiting. What exactly had transpired? What was the meaning of this sudden, unexpected turn? The air still crackled, but now it vibrated with a different kind of energy, one born of respect and a touch of fear. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. To understand the full weight of that moment in the gym, we need to go back, way back, to the bustling streets of 1940s Hong Kong, where a young Bruce Lee first drew breath. Born in the Chinese hospital in San Francisco, but raised in Kowloon, Hong Kong, his early life was a vibrant mix of traditional Chinese customs and the emerging influence of the West. It was a city alive with energy, a place where ancient traditions met the modern world, often clashing, sometimes blending. Bruce, or Lee Junfan as he was known then, grew up in a lively household. His father, Lee Hoi Chuen, was a famous Cantonese opera star, and his mother, Grace Ho, came from a wealthy and influential Eurasian family. This theatrical background meant young Bruce was no stranger to the spotlight. even appearing in several films as a child actor. This early exposure to performance, to understanding movement and presence, subtly shaped his perception of the world and his own body. His family's routines, often dictated by his father's demanding performance schedule, instilled a certain discipline, an understanding of dedication, even if it wasn't always consciously recognized by a young boy. The social climate of post-war Hong Kong was a complex tapestry, a place rebuilt from conflict, where resilience was a daily necessity. This environment, with its blend of different cultures and constant change, fostered in Lee a unique perspective, an openness to new ideas that would later define his approach to martial arts. He saw the world not as fixed, but as fluid, adaptable. Despite his eventual legendary status, Bruce Lee was not born a superhero. In his early years, he faced challenges that might surprise many. He was small for his age, a vulnerability often exploited by the bullies common in any schoolyard. Traditional schooling didn't always suit his energetic and independent spirit, and he often found himself in street fights, not always emerging victorious. These early struggles, these moments of feeling small or overpowered, weren't weaknesses. They were the crucible in which his later philosophy was forged. They taught him that size wasn't everything, that brute force often had limits. Even then, amidst the scrapes and the classroom boredom, the seeds of his dreams were being sown. He dreamed of mastering martial arts, not just as a sport or a defense mechanism, but as a path to self-expression, a way to move beyond the rigid forms and traditions he observed around him. He saw martial arts as something living, adaptable, unlike the fixed, almost dance-like routines many older masters insisted upon. He wanted to understand the essence of fighting, the most efficient way to achieve a goal, rather than just following prescribed movements. The bodybuilder in the gym, with his towering physique and dismissive attitude, represented a mindset that Bruce Lee had encountered, in various forms, his entire life. This wasn't just a random encounter. It was the culmination of years of Lee pushing against the prevailing idea that physical bulk and conventional power were the ultimate measures of strength. The bodybuilder's arrogance wasn't unique. It was a common thread running through the traditional martial arts community, where established masters often judged skill by adherence to ancient forms or by sheer physical size. Lee's life, from those early days facing bullies to his later innovations, was a preparation for confronting this very opposition, for proving that true power resided not in muscle mass, but in efficiency, speed, and an unyielding spirit. His entire being was a testament to the idea that bones could indeed become an undeniable force. Bruce Lee's journey to America, a land he hoped would be more open to his innovative ideas, was not without its own set of trials, subtle slights that accumulated over time, chipping away at his spirit. These were not the overt confrontations of his youth in Hong Kong, but rather a more insidious form of disrespect, mirroring the bodybuilder's later dismissal. He arrived with a vision, a desire to share his understanding of martial arts, but often found closed doors and veiled condescension. There were many instances where established martial arts masters, deeply entrenched in their traditional ways, refused to teach him or even acknowledge his insights, simply because he was not fully Chinese in their eyes, or because his ideas challenged their rigid doctrines. They saw his mixed heritage as a dilution, his fresh perspectives as an affront to centuries of tradition. These were not outright rejections, but rather subtle dismissals, polite smiles that hid judgment and the quiet refusal to engage with his revolutionary thoughts. He would present a new technique, a more efficient movement, only to be met with a condescending nod and a lecture on the sanctity of ancient forms. These moments, though seemingly minor, were like tiny cuts, each one adding to a growing sense of frustration and isolation. He also encountered veiled humiliations, instances where he was invited to demonstrate, only to find himself in a situation designed to expose his perceived weaknesses, rather than to genuinely explore his strengths. Promises of collaboration or teaching opportunities often dissolved into thinly disguised attempts to control his teachings, to mold his unique philosophy into something more palatable, more traditional, and ultimately less effective. They wanted a diluted version of Bruce Lee, one that wouldn't rock their established boat. He was often challenged to prove his worth, not in a direct fight, but through subtle tests of loyalty to outdated customs or demands to conform to norms that he knew limited true martial expression. These were not overt battles, but rather a constant, low-level war against manipulation and injustice, a fight to maintain the integrity of his vision. One memorable instance involved a prominent martial arts figure who initially praised Li's talent, offering him a seemingly lucrative opportunity to teach. However, the offer came with strings attached. Li would have to teach only Chinese students and adhere strictly to the traditional curriculum, suppressing his own evolving ideas. It was a broken promise of acceptance, a veiled attempt to co-opt his skill without embracing his philosophy. Li, ever the independent thinker, politely declined, understanding that compromise on his core principles was not an option. This decision, while protecting his integrity, often left him feeling like an outsider, a renegade in a world that valued conformity. Another time, while demonstrating a new concept to a group of martial artists, an older master openly scoffed, stating that Li's methods lacked spiritual depth because they deviated from classical forms. It was a public and humiliating dismissal, not of his physical prowess, but of his intellectual contribution, his very philosophy. These were not challenges to his physical strength, but rather to his mind, his spirit, and his vision. Each slight, each dismissal, each attempt to control or diminish his innovative approach served to deepen his resolve. The recurring theme of being underestimated, of having his ideas deemed unconventional or disrespectful, fueled a quiet fire within him. He understood intimately that the gym confrontation was not an isolated incident. It was the culmination of years of battling against conventional thinking, against prejudice, and against the dismissal of his unique approach to martial arts. Every past slight, every broken promise, every moment of veiled humiliation had added a drop to the overflowing bucket of his determination. He had faced countless bodybuilders of tradition and closed-mindedness throughout his life, each one unknowingly preparing him for the moment he would finally stand face to face with a literal one. His response, when it came, would be more than just a physical reaction. It would be the embodiment of years of accumulated emotional and philosophical struggle. As Li's recognition grew, so did the pressure he faced, especially in the lead-up to that fateful gym encounter. The emotional atmosphere around him became suffocating, a thick cloud of expectation, judgment, and outright antagonism. It wasn't just physical challenges he was navigating anymore. It was a constant mental and emotional battle. Discussions with traditionalists, once merely debates, now intensified into heated arguments. His revolutionary approach, Jeet Kune Do, was no longer just an interesting concept. It was seen as a direct rebellion against centuries of established martial arts practices. They accused him of disrespecting ancestors, of diluting sacred forms, and of prioritizing mere street fighting over true discipline. These were not intellectual disagreements. They were personal attacks on his character and his legacy. Every time he tried to explain his philosophy of adaptability and efficiency, it was met with hardened faces and accusations of heresy. The tension in these meetings was palpable, often ending with slammed doors and unsaid threats. The arguments didn't stop there. His decision to teach non-Chinese students became a flashpoint, challenging deeply ingrained cultural norms. In a time when martial arts were often considered a closed secret, reserved for specific ethnic groups, Li's open-door policy was scandalous to many. He was ostracized by some segments of the Chinese community, accused of betraying his heritage by sharing their secrets with outsiders. This wasn't just about fighting techniques, it was about identity, loyalty, and tradition. He believed martial arts transcended race, but many around him saw it as an affront, a dilution of their cultural pride. The social pressure was immense, a constant hum of disapproval that followed him everywhere. He faced growing pressure from within the martial arts community, certainly, but also from the public at large. Neighbors and even some relatives, once proud of his accomplishments, now expressed concern or outright disapproval of his unconventional methods and lifestyle. Whispers followed him. He's too radical. He's lost his way. He's disrespecting the elders. His innovative approach to training, his unique philosophies, and his boundary-pushing lifestyle were seen as eccentricities, then as provocations. People who once admired him now looked at him with suspicion, their eyes filled with judgment. The bodybuilder in this period became more than just a potential physical opponent. He represented a prevailing attitude, a mindset of physical dominance and narrow-mindedness that Lee was constantly fighting against. This man, with his emphasis on sheer size and brute strength, was a living, breathing symbol of everything Lee's philosophy sought to dismantle. He was the embodiment of the societal skepticism and disdain for anything that challenged the status quo of brute force. The bodybuilder's condescending attitude wasn't just a personal insult, it was a manifestation of this broader cultural disdain for Lee's intellect, his agility, and his groundbreaking ideas. This period was, without a doubt, a time of profound emotional suffocation for Lee. He felt misunderstood, isolated, and constantly under scrutiny. Every step he took, every word he spoke was dissected and criticized. It was a relentless assault on his spirit, a feeling of being trapped by the very recognition he had worked so hard to achieve. The weight of these expectations and criticisms pressed down on him, pushing him to a breaking point. This constant, internal pressure cooker built up an immense desire for a decisive action, an undeniable demonstration that would silence the critics and validate his life's work. The gym incident, therefore, was not just a random confrontation. It was the inevitable explosion of years of pent-up frustration, a moment where the accumulated emotional and philosophical struggle would finally find its physical expression. The constant pressure, the endless criticism, the feeling of being an outsider, even when surrounded by admirers. It all culminated in a pivotal moment. It wasn't a sudden burst of anger, but a slow, burning realization that he could no longer afford to seek external validation. The immediate trigger for this turning point was a particularly harsh public critique of his methods, not from a fellow martial artist, but from a prominent cultural critic who wrote a scathing article in a widely read publication. The critic dismissed Jeet Kune Do as an unrefined street brawl, a crude imitation of true martial arts, and Lee himself as an arrogant upstart who disrespected centuries of tradition. This wasn't just another slight. It felt like a personal betrayal, as the critic had previously shown interest in his work. The article painted him as a charlatan, not a visionary. Reading those words, seeing his life's passion reduced to a mockery, something inside Lee shifted. It wasn't despair, but a cold, clear resolve. He had endured dismissals, veiled humiliations, and broken promises for too long. This public shaming, however, pushed him past the point of caring what others thought. He realized that trying to appease everyone was a losing battle. He had to be true to himself, even if it meant standing alone. In that moment, Lee made a conscious decision to fully embrace his own path, regardless of external validation. He would no longer dilute his philosophy or training methods to gain acceptance. His commitment to be water would become absolute, not just a concept he taught, but a way he lived and trained. He would shed the rigid forms of traditional martial arts and the equally rigid expectations of society. This meant an unwavering belief in his own training methods, even if it alienated more people. He understood that true mastery came from within, from an honest exploration of one's own capabilities, not from adherence to outdated dogma. This commitment wasn't just theoretical, it translated into a renewed intensity in his training. He pushed his body and mind to their limits, experimenting with new exercises, refining his techniques, and constantly seeking efficiency and adaptability. He documented everything, analyzing his movements, his breathing, his diet. He became his own most rigorous teacher and student. The gym, once a place of shared practice, became his laboratory, a sanctuary where he could strip away the superficial and focus solely on what worked. It was during this period of intense self-focus that an unexpected opportunity arose, one that would force him to demonstrate the effectiveness of his principles in a high-stakes public setting. The bodybuilder, still a looming figure in the periphery of his social circle, had grown bolder in his public dismissal of Lee. The Bones comment, initially a private sneer, had become a recurring joke among the bodybuilder's peers, a casual way to mock Lee's lean physique and unconventional approach. The bodybuilder, riding high on a recent powerlifting victory, publicly declared that Li's fancy moves were useless against real strength, challenging anyone to prove him wrong. This wasn't a direct challenge to Li, but it was aimed squarely at his philosophy, everything he believed in. It was the final straw, the perfect setup. Li saw it not as an insult, but as an opening. This public dismissal, epitomized by the bodybuilder's arrogant words, was the narrative key that unlocked the next phase of his story. It presented the ideal scenario to expose the truth about the efficacy of his approach versus brute strength, not just for himself, but for anyone who doubted. He knew this was his chance to show the world that speed, precision, and adaptability were far more potent than mere muscle mass. This was the moment for his philosophy to leave the dojo and enter the arena of public perception, to be judged not by critics or traditionalists, but by raw, undeniable results. The public challenge, though indirect, hit Li with a whirlwind of emotions. There was a surge of anger, a familiar frustration at the persistent misunderstanding of his art, but beneath it, a current of excitement. This was his chance. Yet, doubt, a ghost from his earlier struggles, still lingered. What if he failed? What if, despite all his training, the sheer mass of the bodybuilder proved too much? He had faced criticism and ridicule before, but this felt different. This was a public demonstration, a test not just of his skill, but of his entire philosophy. The internal shame of past struggles, of being dismissed, of having his ideas called un-Chinese, threatened to resurface. He had to push past it, to channel that emotional energy into raw focus. His wife, Linda, was his rock during this period. She had witnessed his journey from a passionate young man to a visionary martial artist. When he told her about the bodybuilder's public taunts and his decision to accept the unspoken challenge, she didn't hesitate. Her support was unwavering, a quiet strength that anchored him. She understood the depth of his convictions and the importance of this moment for him. She saw the fire in his eyes, the almost desperate need to prove that his path was valid. She became his confidant, his sounding board, offering encouragement and a calm perspective when his own thoughts became tumultuous. Not everyone in his circle shared Linda's understanding. Some of his former martial arts peers, particularly those steeped in traditional Chinese martial arts, viewed his approach with disdain. They saw his Jeet Kune Do as a bastardization of ancient forms, a disrespectful deviation from centuries of established practice. The bodybuilder's challenge only fueled their criticism. They whispered that Li was arrogant, that he was abandoning his heritage for Western concepts of individualism. These adversaries publicly criticized his methods, sometimes subtly, sometimes overtly, attempting to undermine his efforts and discredit his philosophy. They saw his willingness to engage in such a public spectacle as further proof of his departure from honorable martial arts traditions. The cultural dynamics at play were significant. In Hong Kong and even among Chinese communities in America, there was a deeply ingrained respect for tradition. Li's decision to teach non-Chinese students to blend different fighting styles and to openly question the rigid forms of kung fu was seen by many as a betrayal. He was accused of revealing sacred secrets to outsiders, of diluting the essence of Chinese martial arts. This racial bias wasn't always explicit, but it manifested in subtle exclusions, in the reluctance of established masters to engage with his ideas, and in the quiet disapproval from community elders. It was a constant undercurrent, a weight that pressed down on him, making his chosen path even more challenging. The psychological impact on Li was profound. He faced a gnawing isolation, feeling like a lone wolf against a tide of conventional thinking. The intense scrutiny from both admirers and detractors created an immense burden. Every move he made, every word he spoke, was dissected and judged. He had to reconcile his personal convictions with the external pressures and judgments, a task that required immense mental fortitude. He often spent hours in quiet contemplation, visualizing the encounter, refining his strategy, and steeling his mind against the potential for failure. He understood that this wasn't just about winning a fight, it was about validating a lifetime of dedication, a revolutionary philosophy that he believed could change the world of martial arts. The weight of this responsibility rested heavily on his shoulders, but it also forged an unshakable resolve within him. He was ready to prove that bones could indeed move mountains. Lee began the arduous process of rebuilding not just his reputation, but his entire approach to martial arts and life. He threw himself into rigorous training, pushing his body and mind to new limits. Every punch, every kick, every movement was a refinement of Jeet Kune Do, stripping away the unnecessary and embracing pure efficiency. He dedicated himself to teaching a new generation of students, not just techniques, but the philosophy behind them, the importance of adaptability, self-expression, and finding one's own truth in combat. His dojo became a sanctuary for innovation, a place where traditional boundaries were challenged and new possibilities explored. He saw the fire in the eyes of his students, a reflection of his own youthful passion, and it fueled his determination. The bodybuilder, or rather the mindset he represented, faced its ultimate consequence. As Lee's methods gained widespread recognition and proved demonstrably superior in practical application, the idea that brute strength alone was enough began to crumble. The bones comment, once a sneer of contempt, became a historical footnote, a testament to misjudgment. The bodybuilder, whose name faded from public memory, found himself overshadowed by the very man he had dismissed. There was no public humiliation orchestrated by Lee, no grand scheme for revenge. Instead, the world simply moved on, leaving behind the outdated notion that size always equated to power. The quiet, internal realization of his own limitations and arrogance must have been a bitter pill to swallow for the bodybuilder, a stark contrast to the growing wave of respect and admiration that now followed Lee. The story concludes with Lee achieving a level of mastery and recognition that transcended the initial conflict. It wasn't about winning a single fight, but about winning the argument for an entirely new way of thinking about martial arts. His philosophy of be water, of adapting to any situation, resonated with people far beyond the confines of a dojo. He became a global icon, a symbol of perseverance, and a testament to the power of self-belief. His films showcased the beauty and effectiveness of his art, inspiring millions and breaking down cultural barriers. This was a satisfying resolution, not born of revenge, but through the undeniable validation of his philosophy and the profound impact he had on the world. He didn't just defeat an opponent, he shifted paradigms. Lee's journey from a small, often underestimated young man to a martial arts legend underscores the importance of authenticity, perseverance, and challenging conventional wisdom. The initial disrespect, the dismissive "you're nothing but bones," ultimately fueled his transformation. It ignited a fire within him, pushing him to prove that true strength lay not in size or rigid tradition, but in skill, adaptability, and an unyielding spirit. He taught the world that limitations are often self-imposed, and that by embracing one's unique path, one can achieve extraordinary things. His legacy continues to inspire, reminding us that even the smallest among us can move mountains, and that true power comes from within. He didn't just change martial arts, he changed how people thought about what was possible, leaving an indelible mark on history.